Hello there. So which science was it? The science of saving the nation or the science of saving Matt Hancock's face? All during the health emergency, we were constantly told, we are following the science. And further, we were told that the warnings that we were all about to drop dead were also based on the science. The 2-metre queuing, the face coverings, and the 2-week stay-at-home periods were all based on the science. We had to comply with all of this, or the science tells us that the casualty rate would go through the roof. But now we hear through the Telegraph lockdown files that scientists at the time were calling the 14-day period into question and saying it should be shortened. But that didn't suit the politics of the situation, with Matt Hancock, the health secretary at the time, saying that reducing that period would sound like a massive loosening, and also that it sounded like they'd been getting it wrong all along. No thought of a grown-up announcement that things aren't quite as bad as we thought, followed by an easing of restrictions, it seems. Sounds like the intelligence of the proletariat was being called into question. As far as I can see, the medical and scientific experts were trying, maybe, to ease back on all of this, but the politicians were keen to keep it going in case they were seen to have been wrong, or at least one politician was. But do remember that the politicians and scientists stood shoulder to shoulder at all the press conferences while doom-laden pearls of wisdom dripped from their lips. And all that time the ordinary people were needlessly sat at home with all the loneliness, all the lack of earnings, all the people frightened to go to the doctors, all the terror and all the depression. While Matt Hancock was at the same time trying to get special travel and isolation dispensations for the wealthy and powerful. Why weren't we at the forefront of using the science to get out of the clutches of that socially and economically destructive cycle of stay-at-home orders that ultimately resulted in that ruinous technology-driven pingdemic? And one of the main drivers here was the shutting down of dissent across all mainstream and social media. There was only one game allowed in town, terrorising the people, and there were plenty of politicians, celebs and journalists out there who were more than happy to join in. In fact, they revelled in their power to do so, demanding more and more isolation, and even going as far as demanding forced medical interventions. We must never forget this. So Project Fear was deployed to ensure maximum compliance from the people in response to the health emergency. So do you think they're doing the same with that other science issue, net zero? I would argue that they are, and that it's been going on for decades, and once again there are politicians, journalists and celebs who are revelling in their power to terrify the masses and shut down any net zero dissenting voices. And talking of net zero, now this is a real eye-opener, and the real reason why the government ploughs on with net zero regardless. Do you despair at the whole UK political and establishment machine slavishly following the UK destroying net zero agenda? Do you despair at the amount of your hard-earned money that you have to shovel into the maw of the energy producers? Do you wonder why solutions such as fracking or drilling for more oil and gas are completely off limits? Are you getting more enraged at the plans to tax you out of your car? Well, believe it or not, the Tories and the Brussels bureaucrats colluded to ensure the whole lot was baked into our future when they negotiated and finalised the Brexit trade agreement. Yes. Here's what Brexiteer and former Brexit Party MEP Ben Habib told us at the Unite the Centre-Right of Politics conference on Saturday.
Then the other method by which they prevented Brexit from happening is in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We've signed up to something called a level playing field, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So we've signed up to aligning ourselves with EU law, such as it was on the 31st of December 2020 when we left the single market, in matters of state aid, employment, competition, and environment. So, for example, under the environmental provisions, we cannot get off the net zero bandwagon. We are committed in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement not to regress from any environmental laws that were on British statute books at 31st December 2020. And remember, Theresa May, as one of her parting shots, put onto our statutes book a commitment to deliver net zero by 2050. And the commitment is explicit. Even if these laws have future effect, we're not allowed to deviate from them. So net zero is a matter of treaty commitment.
So what the cosy London/Brussels cabal did was put their pet projects into a treaty. And now we're all tied into them via international treaty law and forced to follow through on all of it, whether we like it or not. And be in no doubt, no present or future government, whether it be red or blue, will ever change any of this, not one jot of it. The UK and EU are now tied into the same ramshackle handcart, hurtling towards a net zero hell, with the only way out for us being to exercise the right to terminate the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement with 1 year's notice. And no one will ever be able to convince me that Theresa May did not realise this when she imposed the 2050 net zero commitment on this country, and that was then followed by the whole of Parliament across the Commons and Lords following through and making sure that the commitment remained in place until the Brexit agreements were all signed up and we were fully shackled in. After all, the last thing that any of them really wanted, and that sadly seems to include the Brexiteer politicians, the last thing they wanted was for a free UK to have the capability to go its own way and outperform the EU in anything. Now, I'm no expert, but as far as I can see, the EU is also tied into these requirements. If so, any backsliding by the likes of Germany to keep their manufacturing in profit could be in breach of these rules as well. But only the UK will ever be held to account for failing to adhere to these rules. So when you go to the ballot box at the next election, whether it be for a general, local or mayoral election, don't vote for the Lib Lab Green Con, because a vote for them is a vote to continue this nonsense. Every one of those parties will have a woolly declaration in their manifesto about making the environment better. Something that actually means wholesale social change and the impoverishment of the ordinary person through tax to achieve it. To change the country, you need to start by changing your vote. But voting will not now be enough. You must then demand that the people you elect actually set about delivering their democratic mandate, not ignoring it and following the Westminster blob and supranational WEF type agendas.